Lecture 24, Long Shadows and the Dark Ages Revisited.
Welcome back. In the first lecture of this course, we examined the lives and ideas of two historians who have dominated the field of late Roman and early medieval history, the Englishman Edward Gibbon and the Belgian Henri Pirenne. Gibbon conceived of the fall of the Roman Empire in political and cultural terms. The deposing of the last Roman emperor in the West in 476, the abandonment of classical Latin, these constituted for Gibbon the fall of Rome. And Gibbon explained this fall in terms of barbarian invasions during the 4th and 5th centuries, barbarian invasions that succeeded on account of Christianity, because Christianity had weakened the Roman Empire, sapping it of the will to resist against the barbarians by focusing people's minds on the next world and making them relatively indifferent to this one. Pirenne conceived of Rome's fall not so much in political and cultural terms as in economic terms. For him, the fall of Rome means the end of the ancient economy, an economy centered on a thriving Mediterranean commerce. And Pirenne's periodization of the fall of Rome was rather different from Gibbon's. According to Pirenne, the barbarian invasions of the 4th and 5th centuries were without great economic consequence for Rome. The Roman economy was still doing very well during this period. It's not until the 7th century that you see a dramatic change in the economic fortunes of Rome and its successor barbarian kingdoms. The reason for this economic change, according to Pirenne, the Arab conquests of North Africa and of Spain, which ends the economic unity of the Mediterranean world and results in Europe being, as Pirenne put it, blockaded by the Arabs, forced back on its own woefully inadequate resources, and which will result in an anemic and underdeveloped Carolingian economy. Now that we've examined in some detail the actual history of late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, it's time for us to revisit the theories of Gibbon and Pirenne to see which elements have withstood the test of time and which elements have not. And it's time for us to tackle the most vexing questions in our field. Why does the Roman Empire fall? And what do we mean by fall? And what is the nature of the early Middle Ages? Let's start with Gibbon's theory concerning the fall of the Roman Empire. There are modern historians, very good modern historians, who are sympathetic to Gibbon, and you can hear echoes of Gibbon in some of the theories they've advanced about the fall of the Roman Empire. You can find historians who feel that, yes, Christianity did play some role in the collapse of the Roman Empire, perhaps not by distracting people from the reality of barbarian invasion, but in terms of burdening the Roman economy with an unproductive large group of clerics who could not fight against the barbarians, who diverted resources away from military expenditure. Oddly enough, you'll find some echoes of Gibbon's ideas in the work of modern European Marxist historians who, although ideologically quite removed from the Enlightenment Gibbon, nonetheless feel that Gibbon was onto something when he argued that the lack of a will to resist is at the heart of the fall of the Roman Empire. Modern Marxist historians, though, identify class inequality in the Roman Empire as leading to this lack of will to resist, that poor inhabitants of the Roman Empire didn't fight against the barbarians, indeed welcomed them as liberators because they were tired of being exploited economically by the rich. There is probably some element of truth in these ideas, but Gibbon's broader contention that Christianity is the primary ultimate cause of the fall of the Roman Empire has to be rejected, as Gibbon himself should have understood. Gibbon is well aware of the fact that in 476, only the western half of the Roman Empire disintegrates politically, that the eastern half of the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, survives 476 and indeed survives into the 15th century. Gibbon's massive decline and fall tells the story of the Byzantine Empire. It doesn't end until 1453 when the Turks conquer Constantinople. Yet Gibbon himself did not realize or refuse to admit the consequences of the East's survival for his own theory that Christianity had caused the fall of the Roman Empire. Because the eastern half of the Roman Empire was the more thoroughly Christianized half of the Roman Empire. Indeed, Christianity originates in the eastern half of the Roman Empire. It had existed there longer. It had gained more converts. If Christianity was responsible for the fall of the Roman Empire, then one would have expected the East to go first and this West to fall last. Instead, precisely the opposite happened. And this realization that East survives West by almost 1,000 years can be applied to other theories concerning the fall of the Roman Empire. Not too long ago, there was a theory that received a lot of attention in the news that lead poisoning had caused the fall of the Roman Empire. That lead from the pipes in the Roman water system had left the Romans too loopy to fight against the barbarians, that they are now so mentally damaged that they didn't know what to do. They used the same pipes in the East as in the West, and they drank the same water, but somehow the folks in the East were not too loopy to fight against the barbarians. In explaining the fall of the Roman Empire, therefore, we need to rephrase the question from why does the Roman Empire fall to why does the western half of the Roman Empire disintegrate in the 5th century, while the eastern half of the Roman Empire does not disintegrate in the 5th century. And to answer this better question, we have to focus on the differences that separated West from East, that put the West at a disadvantage and the East at an advantage. One of the most important differences is simply geographical. The western half of the Roman Empire had a much longer frontier with Germanic barbarians than did the eastern half of the Roman Empire. According to Diocletian's division of the Roman Empire, all of the Rhine River frontier falls within the west, and much of the Danube River frontier also falls within the west. The east is responsible only for a relatively small section of the Danube River frontier, which is easier to protect because it's so limited in size. Furthermore, the West was at a serious geographical disadvantage vis-a-vis the barbarians, because once the very long Rhine-Danube frontier had been breached in the West, barbarians could get anywhere they wanted in the western half of the empire. It was a straight shot into Gaul. It was easy to get into Italy by crossing the Alps, to get into Spain by crossing the Pyrenees, to get into North Africa by crossing the Straits of Gibraltar. The barbarians could go anywhere they wished. In the eastern half of the Roman Empire, even if barbarians did get across the Danube River frontier, they are confined to the Balkans. They cannot get past Constantinople. They do not get to Asia Minor. They do not get to Syria or Palestine. And indeed, as we've seen, barbarian groups that entered the eastern half of the Roman Empire tended to bounce out of the Balkans and eventually head west simply because they were out of room and there was nowhere else for them to go. This means that the western half of the Roman Empire is much more vulnerable to barbarian invasions because that's where the barbarians are ultimately going to wind up. Another essential difference that will explain why the West disintegrates while the East does not, the resources available to the two halves of the Roman Empire. The East was richer than the West. It had more cities. It had bigger cities. It had more active commercial life. It had most likely a larger population as well. And as a result, it had an easier task and more weapons with which to deal with the barbarian threat. The West is relatively poor, and as a result is very hard put to deal with barbarian migrations. Ironically, Diocletian's creation of the Tetrarchy exacerbated the problems facing the West, because once he divides the West and the East, the West can no longer draw upon the resources of the East, as had been the case before the division of the empire. And so a solution intended to strengthen the empire by allowing emperors to respond more quickly to threats along the empire's frontiers had long-term consequences that were quite harmful to the western half, at least. Rephrasing the question of why did the Roman Empire fall, as why did the West collapse but the East did not collapse, is progress, but it's not the perfect solution. Because as we have seen in our consideration of the western half of the Roman Empire, Rome did not fall at once when you think of Rome as a civilization, as a form of government, as a way of life, as a form of social organization. In some parts of the West, Rome as a culture was gone before 476. This is the case in Britain. In most parts of the West, it persists long after 476. In the Kingdom of the Franks, much that is distinctively Roman persists until the 7th century before it finally peters out and disappears. And we need to ask ourselves, why is it that Roman culture and civilization do not ultimately survive in most of the barbarian kingdoms, despite the efforts of barbarian kings to preserve the Roman past and to rule in a Roman manner and to maintain Roman institutions? Why do the Roman cities disappear and all that is associated with those cities? Well, the leading theory at present, I believe, is one that people sometimes find hard to accept initially because it runs so contrary to their own experiences today. We live in a period of such remarkably sustained population growth that it is hard for us to envision a world in which there are sudden drops in population and a world in which there is a sustained drop in population lasting several centuries on end. Nonetheless, this is apparently what happens in the Roman Empire beginning as early as the 2nd century AD, certainly by the 3rd century AD, and continuing most likely into the 7th century. There are just fewer people century after century after century. The disruptions caused by the barbarian migrations of the 4th and 5th centuries will contribute to this drop in population. People die as a result of having their towns sacked by barbarians. But the depopulation appears to have set in before the barbarian migrations of the 4th and 5th centuries. And in a sense, we now understand the barbarian migrations not as the cause of the fall of the Roman Empire, but as a symptom, as a sign of a much more profound problem that is afflicting Rome from the 2nd and 3rd centuries onward. This depopulation helps to explain why Rome can successfully deal with the Germanic invasions of the 3rd century, but cannot do so in the 4th and 5th centuries. It helps to explain why Romans become more and more dependent on barbarians to serve in their army, to the point where barbarian generals are able to depose the last Roman emperor in the West. And while depopulation afflicts both halves of the Roman Empire, the West and the East, because of its greater resources, is able to withstand the shock of depopulation far better than the West was able to withstand it. Now, measuring population levels in a period as remote as late antiquity is difficult to do. Even in our own day and age, trying to figure out how many people live in our country is a daunting task that we complete very imperfectly. Nonetheless, by combining written evidence and archaeological evidence, a compelling picture, I think, has been drawn by historians that illustrates this phenomenon of depopulation. In terms of the archaeological evidence, archaeology has revealed the steady decay of urban structures throughout the Roman Empire, beginning as early as the 2nd and 3rd centuries. This process will occur most drastically in Britain, where urban life is done by 450 and will not resume for several centuries. It progresses more slowly the farther south one goes in the Roman Empire, but nonetheless, wherever you turn, Italy, Spain, southern Gaul, Britain, you see the same general trend, urban decay. As for what I mean by urban decay, you find that the construction of monumental buildings, of aqueducts and baths and chariot stadiums, that this construction slows down and finally grinds to a halt. You find that the public buildings in Roman towns and cities are no longer put to the uses for which they were originally intended. You find, for example, people living in the Roman baths where there should have been water. Either people had developed gills in the 4th century, or no one is filling up the baths anymore and using them as they should have been used. You find, perhaps most remarkably, large chunks of towns and cities entirely abandoned. And city walls, when they are rebuilt during the period of late antiquity, they're always built smaller. They enclose a smaller area century after century, precisely the opposite of what you'll find in the High Middle Ages, where city walls are expanded and expanded again and again. The fact that the city walls are shrinking, that the portions of towns that are inhabited are likewise shrinking, suggests that there is a drop in population occurring within the Roman world. And it should be noted that archaeology has revealed that while certainly some Roman towns are sacked by the barbarians, and you will find some towns where the buildings have been burned and where you find corpses of people who died violently and were never buried and a sign of battle, more often than not, what you find in these archaeological excavations is simply layers of black earth piling up, a sign of abandonment and disuse rather than violent death for these towns. Perhaps the towns are shrinking, but the population in the countryside is growing. Archaeology also suggests that this is not the case, that the number of inhabited sites out in the countryside is likewise growing smaller and smaller. And those sites that remain in existence, that still have people living there, they're not getting any bigger. So the countryside is not simply absorbing the population of the towns. There are indeed fewer people around than had been the case centuries earlier. Written evidence confirms the picture that archaeology has been drawing for historians. Imperial laws, especially, are a great source of information about what is going on in the final centuries of the Roman Empire's existence, and these laws are greatly concerned with a phenomenon known as the agri deserti, the abandoned fields, as we could translate this term. Abandoned lands might also work. The Roman tax system was based on a land tax, and so Roman rulers were very concerned when large amounts of abandoned land started to appear within the Roman Empire, because no tax revenue could be collected from these lands. And beginning in the 2nd century, you start to see concern with the number of abandoned lands in the empire, and still more concern in the 3rd, and then the 4th, and then the 5th centuries. By this time, you have a virtual obsession with all the empty space within the Roman Empire. In the best autocratic tradition of the later Roman Empire, imperial laws also dealt with the phenomenon of shrinking cities. Town officials were ordered to sweep through the countryside and scoop up anyone who had once lived in a town and drag them back to the town and force them to live there to try and put a stop to this process of urban decay. Contemporary legislative concern with depopulation, acknowledgement of the fact that we have all this empty space and that we're having trouble keeping our cities going, suggests that archaeology is not misleading us when it suggests that the Roman Empire is experiencing severe depopulation. As for what is causing the depopulation of the later Roman Empire, well, the leading theory at present is that our answer is epidemiological, that a series of outbreaks of new diseases within the Roman world touches off depopulation. The first major outbreak of disease that perhaps begins this whole process is known as the Antonine Plague, which ran its course from 165 to 180 AD. You find contemporaries in the 3rd century remarking upon new illnesses emerging within the population. There's another major outbreak of disease from 251 to 266 AD. And while historians are not entirely certain what these new diseases were, it's been suggested that during the 2nd and the 3rd centuries AD, measles and smallpox made their first appearance in the Roman Empire, probably coming from China. In the 6th century, the final and worst epidemiological blow, though, the appearance of bubonic plague in Europe for the first time in the Justinianic plague, which arrives in the years 542 and 543. It's difficult to find precise figures for this drop in population. But to give you some sense of how drastic it was, we can consider the history of the city of Rome itself. Rome probably had around 1 million inhabitants during the lifetime of Augustus, say 1 AD. By about 450, its population was down probably to about 400,000 people. By the time you get to Charlemagne's lifetime, the population of Rome had probably been whittled down to 10 to 20,000 people in a city built for 1 million people. There was a very high vacancy rate in Rome. You should not imagine that the population of the whole of Europe dropped by 95%. Rome had a long way to fall because it had started out so huge, but nonetheless, it does give you some sense at least of the scope of this depopulation affecting Europe. Depopulation hurts Roman culture and civilization because it led to deurbanization. It led to the collapse of Roman urban life, and so much that was Roman, the Roman culture, the Roman educational system, these things depended on the existence of cities. And once the cities were gone, the educational system collapses. And once the educational system collapses, the Roman bureaucracy collapses because there are no longer literate lay people who can staff the government as they once had. You find the Roman senators losing their distinctive identity with the collapse of the Roman educational system because they can no longer study classical literature in the way they once had. They find themselves swallowed up in the illiterate warrior aristocracy of the barbarians. What one finds is almost a domino effect caused by deurbanization that will result in the collapse of so many other aspects of Roman life. The process of change that I just described is in one sense anticipated by Pirenne very well, who perceived that by 700 Europe was a relatively impoverished place compared to what it had been 500 years earlier. But Pirenne's ideas have been revised in two very important respects. Firstly, his chronology is no longer accepted. The idea that Rome was going just fine until the 7th century and then collapsed does not match up with archaeological evidence anymore. Instead, we see a gradual process of decline beginning as early as the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Furthermore, Pirenne pointed to the Arabs as the culprits, as the cause for European economic collapse. But Arab success at the expense of the Byzantines and the Visigoths, we now understand in much the same way as we understand the Germanic migrations. It's the symptom. It's the sign of a broader social and demographic change taking place. The Arabs succeed in part because the Roman and Byzantine worlds have been so badly weakened by this process of depopulation. As for the nature of the early Middle Ages, well, this was about the only thing that Gibbon and Pirenne might ever have agreed on. They both see the Carolingian period as a low point, as a crude and primitive period worthy, if anything was ever worthy, of the appellation, the Dark Ages. Gibbon, of course, understands this as a cultural darkness. The Latin was just bad by the Carolingian period. Pirenne understands this backwardness in economic terms. He sees the Carolingian economy as representing the low point of European economic history for the last 2,000 years. But historians are not entirely willing to follow Gibbon and Pirenne in their understandings of the Carolingian world. As regards Gibbon, well, there's a certain element of moral judgment in Gibbon's understanding of Carolingian culture. Where Gibbon saw atrocious Latin, historians see an evolving language. They see the emergence of modern Romance languages, French and Spanish and Italian. And historians are not willing to see French as inherently inferior to Latin. It's simply different. And so we don't like to speak of linguistic change in terms of decay. That very naturalistic Roman art is inferior to the more abstract art favored in the early medieval period. That the Colosseum is a more aesthetically pleasing building than Charlemagne's palace at Aachen. These are matters of individual taste. These are not matters of historical fact or even of historical interpretation. And to the extent that modern historians will speak of the Dark Ages at all, it's not to judge culture in the way that Gibbon did. It's simply to acknowledge the limitations of our knowledge about this period in history, and to acknowledge that our source base is much smaller than one would wish, and there will always be a certain obscurity associated with the early medieval world. As for Piren's notion that the Carolingian economy represents the low point in the economic history of medieval Europe, at first glance there would be a lot of disagreement among modern historians about the nature of the Carolingian economy. Some speak of it in very harsh terms as third world and underdeveloped. Others speak almost rhapsodically about how during the Carolingian period recovery is beginning, population growth is resuming, commercial life and urban life are starting to come back. There's an element of truth in both points of view. Compared to what is going to come later in the High Middle Ages, the Carolingian economy does indeed appear underdeveloped and backwards. Compared to the late Roman and post-Roman economy, the Carolingian economy does look like a notable improvement. It is starting to become clear, though, that the Carolingian economy can not be regarded as the low point in the economic history of medieval Europe, that low point is probably reached in the 7th century, and that the 8th and the 9th centuries represent a period of some recovery and substantial recovery. That Pirenne badly underestimated the connections that remained between the Carolingian world and, the House of Islam and the Byzantine Empire. What historians know now that Pirenne did not know, because he did not have access to the same archaeological information that we possess, is that the connection between the Carolingian Empire and the outside world did not simply run through the Mediterranean. It actually ran through the north to a remarkable degree. Beginning in the late 7th century, a thriving commercial life sprang up in the North Sea, and you see the appearance of trading towns such as Dorstad on the European continent, or Hamwick in Anglo-Saxon England, Ribe in Denmark. And this trading network in the North Sea expanded over time. In the 8th century, it comes to include the Baltic Sea and the people living around the Baltic Sea. And late in the 8th century, and in the early 9th century, it even expands through Russia all the way down to Constantinople and the Islamic world, courtesy of the Vikings. The Vikings established a large trading network that historians call the Northern Arc, that runs from the Carolingian Empire in the west down to Damascus and even Baghdad in the east. And Vikings would travel back and forth between these areas, bringing goods from one region to the other. The reason Pirenne did not fully realize that the Northern Arc was as important as it was is that he did not know what we now know, that there are tens of thousands of Islamic silver coins from the 9th and 10th century buried in Scandinavia. A statue of Buddha from the Viking period was recently uncovered in a bog in Sweden. Not what one expected to find in Sweden, but testimony to the fact that the Vikings were ranging very far afield and keeping Carolingian Europe in touch with the rest of the world economically. It also appears now that the Carolingian world had some access to the commercial life of Mediterranean Europe, more than Pirenne was willing to acknowledge. Just a few years ago, in 2001, a huge book was published by a historian named Michael McCormick called Origins of the European Economy, Communications and Commerce 300 to 900. And by studying coin hoards and shipwreck patterns, by studying the movement of saints' relics and the tags attached to saints' relics around the early medieval world, by studying contemporary written accounts of travel, McCormick has reconstructed communications in the Mediterranean during this long period, and he's found that as of 700, there was really only one main route available for people who wanted to travel from the Carolingian world to the Islamic world. But by 900, a half dozen routes had opened up instead, which suggests that there's actually more traffic taking place in 900 than had been the case in 700. Indeed, McCormick has suggested that instead of Arabs blockading Carolingian Europe and acting to the detriment of the European economy, we should understand the House of Islam as an important economic stimulus that actually drives the Carolingian economy forward. What the Carolingians did with those whom they defeated and battled and enslaved was to sell them. They sold them as slaves, and the biggest market for the slaves captured by the Carolingians were to be found in the Islamic world, in Damascus and even in Baghdad. And so in this sense, there is actually almost a beneficial partnership between the House of Islam and Charlemagne, at least in economic terms. McCormick's boldest claim is that the years around 800 should be regarded as the jumping off point for all subsequent European economic growth, that this is the turning point in the economic history of Europe. Most historians traditionally have located this turning point in the fortunes of medieval Europe and its economy in the High Middle Ages, 1000 to 1300. But McCormick suggests that no, it is in fact during Charlemagne's lifetime that the turning point is reached. Is he right? I don't know, and I don't think anyone knows yet. And it's proper that we end with a question rather than with a definitive statement, because the study of late antiquity and the early Middle Ages is an ongoing process, one that is going to continue throughout my lifetime and beyond. And it would behoove me and perhaps all of us to stay tuned to the inevitable future developments. Thank you for your interest in the periods that we've been discussing in this course, and I would be tremendously grateful if this interest continues in the years and the decades to come.
We genuinely hope you've enjoyed these lectures from our Great Courses series. Our courses are available to order online. Please visit our website at www.teach12.com or call our customer service representatives at 1-800-TEACH12. That's 1-800-TEACH12. Thank you very much.